I'm Selena and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a video on retellings because I love retellings. A retelling was actually one of the first books I reviewed on BookTube. That is A Curse of Dark and Lonely. I will link that in the cards if you want to see my really bad review. But since then I have read many more retellings, some of which I love and some of which I just like or think are okay. I'm going to be recommending you a mix of all of those books. The best ones or the most recommendable ones that I have come across thus far. Most of these retellings are either retellings of like canonized like classic novels or Grimm's fairy tales, pretty much. Yeah, Grimm's fairy tales, a couple of other bits of folklore, but it's not a very diverse mix of folklore, which I'm wanting to read more folklore that's inspired by other than European fairy tales that I was familiar with growing up. So continually looking for that, but there is one on here that I think is a good fit for that a lot of people don't know it fits this. So let's just get started. I think I have 10 recommendations for you, and the first one is going to be one of the first ones that I read, and that is Heartless by Marissa Meyer. So this is a retelling of the Queen of Hearts of Alice in Wonderland. So it's more in the vein of the villain retelling, like the villain origin story retelling, rather than a retelling of the actual story that was told. Because if you've read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland or seen any iteration of it that's more true to the text, you know that it follows Alice, a girl who stumbles into Wonderland and meets a lot of interesting characters, one of which is Queen of Hearts, who is kind of the villain of the story. And this book is, I think it is a really interesting take on Wonderland. If you read Alice in Wonderland, you were like, this is a bit too absurdist for me, I need more logic in my worlds, you may want to give Heartless a try, because what Heartless did that was really, really cool to me was it actually added a lot of logic and world building to Wonderland that is not really delved into in the original novel. I love Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but I do think there is something special about Heartless because it was able to do what Alice's Adventures in Wonderland didn't want to do. Like, reading Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, to me, nothing feels like it's necessarily missing, just because I don't think that story is meant to give a like detailed world building or like incredibly complex setting. Like it's an absurdist novel. It's like a nonsense novel kind of. And it's done really well. It's perfect for what it is, in my opinion. But Heartless takes some of that nonsense and some of that absurdism and adds a little bit of worldly logic to it. And then it kind of grounds it in the Victorian time a little bit more, because there are aspects of Wonderland that is based off of like a Victorian idea of like marriage and women's roles and things. And I think that this is where a lot of people get tripped up, because they're like, I didn't ask to see this story in a Alice's Adventures in Wonderland retelling, but I thought it was interesting. I thought it was a really interesting take on it, especially since the commentary of Victorian England and how they treated children is in my opinion very there in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, whereas Heartless kind of takes that a different route and is commenting on women's role in Victorian England. So I think that Heartless is able to do a lot of really cool things, and I think it's just a good story. I think it's a fun story. I gave it 4.5 stars, and with this I can also kind of blanket recommend the Lunar Chronicles, because I'm not going to go into them because they're not one of the 10, but Lunar Chronicles are more Marissa Meyer books. They are sci-fi retellings of various Grimm's fairy tales, so if you're interested in that and you haven't already checked them out, maybe do so. I read them last year and they were really fun, and they're pretty popular, so you've probably already checked them out. But if you haven't read any of these Marissa Meyer retellings, I do recommend it. I know she has a new book out too, Gilded, I think, which is like Rumpelstiltskin, which sounds interesting, but I haven't seen as much praise for Gilded as I have for the Lunar Chronicles, or even Heartless, and Heartless had some mixed reviews as well. I don't know. So I don't know if I'll be reading that one, but if you want a cool Alice's Adventures in Wonderland retelling, I think Heartless fits the bill. So continuing with the children's books retelling theme, I have The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. This, a lot of people don't realize is a retelling. I certainly didn't, but I think it is a retelling of The Jungle Book. This is one of the few retellings on here, maybe the only retelling on here, let me check, where I have not read the original source material. Okay, yeah, I would say that this one is pretty much the only one that has a very concrete source material that I haven't read. And that is, I've just never read The Jungle Book, and I've never seen the movie, so I didn't really understand a lot of the retelling aspects of this. So I can't really recommend this as a amazing retelling of the Jungle Book, because I don't know what the Jungle Book's like intent or values was. But I think that this succeeds in being a fun book, and in a way, to me, I was reading this book and it felt like a Disney movie. I don't know if that is because this book kind of follows the beats of the Jungle Book and that was very easily translatable to a Disney movie, or maybe it follows the beats of the Jungle Book movie more than the book. I don't really know. I don't know much about the Jungle Book, but all I can tell you is that the Graveyard Book is amazing. And if you know the premise of the Jungle Book, then you know that the Jungle Book is this book where a boy is taken in by a lot of different jungle animals and kind of raised by them. This book is, as you may have guessed from the title, is about a boy who was taken in by ghosts in this graveyard and I think something else. I think there's a vampire as well, but I didn't really pick that up on reading. Just because I don't know why, but I think there is a vampire here as well. And they kind of raise this young human boy after his family is murdered. And so this, I would say, is like a young reader sort of children's book, but it's a Neil Gaiman children's book, so it can have darker aspects to it. I didn't find it creepy. I know kids do, and I don't think it's written in the traditional like middle grade style of today, but this book was really amazing. I so enjoyed this book a lot. And the final book that I'm going to recommend that is based off of a specific book, like a specific classic, is going to be my favorite of this section of the video, and that is Peter Darling by Austen Chant. This is the Peter Pan retelling of my dreams. It was so good. So I have a whole video review that is very long with my boyfriend on this. This is one of his favorite books of all time, and now it's one of mine. So I highly recommend you check that out if you want to know our full thoughts on it. We have spoiler and non-spoiler sections to it, but I loved this book so much. Basically, the premise of this is Peter Pan is also Wendy Darling. Peter Pan in his past was called Wendy Darling by his family, and he, as a child, used Neverland as an escape. But we're not following Peter when he's a kid, we're following Peter when he's a fully grown man returning to Neverland on a journey of kind of self-discovery and a little bit of romance as well. This is a very short, deep character study. I have no idea how Austen Chant managed to fit everything they needed to fit into this book and have it feel so full of life, so wonderful. I loved this book so much. It is so good. I highly recommend you pick it up. It deserves so much more love and hype than it gets, and it was just re-released. So one reason that this isn't hyped very much, I think, is because it's been hard to get a hold of for the last several years. Mason wanted to read it really badly, and so I've been kind of watching. How ecstatic was I when Austen Chant on their Twitter announced that this was getting a reprint. That was last summer, and it came out in June again, and with a new beautiful cover that I have on the screen right now, and I highly recommend you check this out. It's the perfect time to, because it's still fairly new, and let's just try and welcome it back into the book world in style. Okay, so now we're moving on into the fairy tale inspired retellings, and first section of this, I'm actually going to start with a very specific fairy tale that is retold, and that is Beauty and the Beast retellings. So Beauty and the Beast retellings are some of my favorites. I love the original story of Beauty and the Beast. And that is very different from Beauty and the Beast's Disney version, but I also think the Disney version is wonderful, very fun. So my favorite Beauty and the Beast retelling, and what is probably still my favorite YA retelling, is A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kemmerer. This is very typical Beauty and the Beast story. You have a girl who is actually from our world, and this is a portal fantasy aspect, who is taken into another world called Emberfall, which needs help releasing itself from a curse. The Prince of Emberfall needs help releasing himself from this curse. And Harper, our main character, is very feisty, very vibrant, very much a beauty type of character. She's also disabled, which is a wonderful rep to have in a YA book like this. Harper is feisty and strong and brave and just such a great character to follow. I loved Harper so much. Oh my goodness, I loved Harper. And then Ren is the love interest, the sort of beast character, and he is one of the very few situations where a guy can be kind of a jerk to the love interest, and have me still root for them, because I was rooting for these two. I thought this book was just so fun and so, I don't know, just like infectiously fun, like infectiously thrilling. I loved this. I read this so fast, and I loved it so much that it was my debut onto YouTube that no one knew about at the time. But I love this book, and if you haven't read it, I do highly recommend it. The second and third book in the series are not my favorite. I gave them both like 3-ish stars, so this was a 5-star, so clearly a step down from me, and I think a lot of people feel very similarly, but I still recommend this book. There will be some unfinished threads, but I think that the story of this book is one that I could reread and just stop there. And then the second Beauty and the Beast retelling and final Beauty and the Beast retelling that I will be mentioning today is For the Wolf by Hannah Whitten. So this is a Beauty and the Beast retelling with the aesthetics of Red Riding Hood, Little Red Cap, that sort of vibe. So basically, the only real similarities this has to Little Red Riding Hood, that sort of story, is the main character's name is Red. It's short for Radaris, and she has this red cloak that she wears, and there's also a character named the Wolf. But it follows a much more Beauty and the Beast type of storyline where a woman is like sacrificed or like sent in some way to live with this beast beast type character, who in this case is not an actual like animalistic beast, but he is a magical being who is very connected to the forest around him. And so this town believes that this woman, who is the second daughter of the ruler, they believe that when a second daughter does come about, when there's more than one daughter, the first daughter will become queen, she's for the throne, and the second daughter is for the wolf. So she will be sacrificed into this literally blood-sucking forest and given to what they believe is a monstrous creature. In reality, this monstrous creature is a man who does have ties to the forest, as I said, but her sacrifice is not what she thought it would be, and she ends up having to kind of team up with this wolf to sort of solve problems with the forest itself and the surrounding area. The next section that I'm going to talk about is other Grimm's fairy tales that inspired some retellings, and the first one's yet another Neil Gaiman book, and that is The Sleeper and the Spindle, and this is an illustrated book, so it's not very long. As you can see, it's very short, and a lot of it beautiful illustrations. I gave this like a 3-star, so it's not my favorite of the list, but it still was good. And this one actually combines 2 fairy tales. So the first one is Snow White, and the second is Sleeping Beauty, or Briar Rose, or whatever it's called in all the different like iterations. And it's pretty much a story of Snow White hears about Sleeping Beauty and heads off to save her. But there's twists at every turn. There's just like twists on Snow White as a character. I believe in the fairy tale, she's very passive, and in the Disney movie, she's very, very passive, but in this, she takes a more active role. And the Sleeping Beauty also just has some subversions and twists that are really interesting. In the end, I thought this was a really fun book that it did stick with me. Like, I think it's more of like a 3.5 because it was just really good. And I do recommend it, especially if you're looking for the more short retellings. I definitely recommend getting a physical copy because, I mean, look. The next fairy tale retelling that I'm going to recommend is House of Salt and Sorrows. So this one is a YA kind of creepy, supposed to be creepy take on the 12 Dancing Princesses retelling. So this is a fairy tale that I think a lot of people know from the Barbie movie. I don't believe I've ever seen the Barbie movie. I think that was kind of after my childhood. I really enjoy this fairy tale in the Grimm's collection. I knew it before I actually started reading the original Grimm's fairy tales somehow. I guess just from, it was in culture somehow. I don't know. But I really do think that the fairy tale is very interesting and cool. And so I'm always psyched to hear about 12 Dancing Princesses retellings. And I think House of Salt and Sorrows had a lot of good in it. I don't think it was as amazing as I was hoping it would be. Like, it wasn't a 5-star for me. It was more like a 3.754. So I still recommend it. But you just have to know what you're getting. Like, I think that this is not as creepy as one might think, but it is creepier than most fairy tale retellings. So this is pretty much, the premise is where we have the 12 dancing princesses. We have 12 princesses who are all like sisters, and they are kind of being picked off one by one. They all keep dying. So the several oldest siblings have died, and there's only like 8 left or something when the book starts. And so it is dark in that sense, and it is dark because there's just some sort of creepy things going on about the castle. It has sort of a, I don't know, I don't want to say gothic vibe because I don't think it quite reaches the level of gothic, but it has a kind of spooky vibe. Like light spooky. I also must say that there is also pretty big romance in this. A lot of fairy tale retellings have a pretty big romance. A lot of YA have pretty big romance. And I wasn't expecting for the romance to take such a front seat in this book, but in my opinion, it really did. So that was also part of why it didn't work amazingly for me, because I was just expecting something different. But I think as long as you know when you're going into it that you're getting a mystery, like a mysterious, slightly creepy sort of YA book that is retelling the 12 Dancing Princesses story pretty closely with kind of added plot stuff and a pretty big focus on romance, then I think you could go in really liking this. And then the final fairy tale specific, well, not even. The final 2 books that talk about specific fairy tales in them also have some more like specific folklore inspired stuff, I believe. And the first one of those I will talk about is a very, very new release and new read for me, and that is 6 Crimson Cranes by Elizabeth Lim. So this actually is retelling 2 things, and I think if you don't know that, then there's parts of this book that can seem pretty bizarre. We follow a girl who is cursed to be silent by her stepmother, because the way that her stepmother ensures this with her magic is that the girl's brothers are turned into 6 cranes, and if our main character Shiori speaks any words, with every word one of her brothers will die. So if she says 6 words, they're all dead. And this is actually from the Grimm fairy tale The 6 Swans. And also the 12 Brothers is very similar, but it's 6 and uses kind of that motif, so it's the six Swans version. And then another part of the curse is our main character Shiori also has a bowl over her head that cannot come off. And I think this was a really clever blending of 2 fairy tales, because there is a fairy tale, I know it is like the girl with the bowl on her head, and this might be more folklore than fairy tale, I don't really know how to tell the difference, that I believe is a Japanese tale. And I remembered reading this. Like as I was reading this and I was like, okay, she's got the bowl. And then like we started getting into like the plot of the book. I was like, okay, something feels very similar about how our main character is treated with the bowl over her head and the themes that this is playing with that. And I remembered that story. I don't know when I read it, sometime when I was very young, but it's a great story. And I love that the author chose to use both of those because it really does, I think it really works. But if you didn't know that the girl with the bowl in her head was like a fairy tale in itself and that aspect of this plot comes from that, then I could see it feeling very random. But I really liked this book. I thought it was really good and just really fun. It has some like plot conveniences or things like that. And I think that that's a lot of fairy tale-esque books, because fairy tales have a lot of plot conveniences. Like they're not meant to be like exquisitely plotted. Everything is logical and thought through. Like things just sort of happen in fairy tales, and so it very much feels like that in terms of the retelling, but it also feels very different from a lot of fairy tales because we're in an Asian inspired setting, and also one of the stories that this is retelling is not a very common story in the Western world. Like it is a Japanese tale, and I thought this was so refreshing and so good to read. And also look at this cover. Oh my goodness. Anyways, I loved it and I highly recommend this one. And then the final 2 books, one of them is very similar to 6 Crimson Cranes in that there is an aspect of it that comes from a very specific Grimm's fairy tale, and then there's others that feel more like folklore. And so that like random tidbits of folklore that maybe aren't associated with just one fairy tale or one story, but are just sort of built into the world. And that book is Spinning Silver. So Spinning Silver, I love this book. This is one of my favorite books of the year. I adore this book so much. It may be my favorite on this list at this point. Yeah, I think it is. I love this book. This has a very specific tale that it retells, sort of, and that is Rumpelstiltskin. And there's one of our characters follows the Rumpelstiltskin sort of story, or it's inspired by the Rumpelstiltskin sort of story, I will say, because it's not at all the same at all. But that character is Miriam, and she's a moneylender who takes over her father's job and has a reputation for kind of turning silver into gold because of how she kind of gets money to come in for her family. And so she draws the attention of the icy kind of fae creatures that live around them called the Stark. And the Stark are brutal. They're not very fun fae to be around. Let's just put it lightly like that. And so we follow Miriam's journey as she attracts their attention, and that's really the start of this book. And then the rest of it goes in completely different directions with her plot. It's kind of like a fairy tale if the fairy tale just kept going and it got better and better and better. And then we also have two other women characters who lead this book named Irina and Wanda. Wanda actually works for Miriam, and she is escaping her own situation of like a demanding, toxic situation with a man in her life. And then Irina's also dealing with pretty much the same thing, but she's not a like working girl in a village. Like, she is a duke's daughter, I believe. And in a way, all three of these women's stories are about resistance to kind of dominating forces in their lives that are usually men. I loved this book so much. It has so much meaning, and you know, it's not a perfect book, but it's pretty close to me. And then the final book that I'm going to recommend is a retelling of a story that I think appears a lot in kind of British folklore, like English legend, but I don't know that I've read a specific tale associated with this character, although I know that he exists and I know like who he is pretty much. And that is a retelling of The Green Man, Silver in the Wood by Emily Tesh. And technically this is a duology, and the second one also deals with that Green Man sort of motif as well. Drowned Country is the second one. But Silver in the Wood and Drowned Country, I adored them both. They were both 5 stars. These are both super short. They are one of my favorite things I've read this year. I adore these little novellas. And pretty much they're about a green man that lives in a forest and kind of presides over it. And then we also follow, or we don't really follow, we're in the perspective of this green man figure, Tobias Finch. But then we follow Tobias as another man named Henry Silver moves in on new property that he's just bought that also overlaps with this forest. So you follow them and you see how they react as trouble comes. I loved this. I've seen people who like Silver in the Wood more than Drowned Country and Drowned Country more than Silver in the Wood. I've seen both, but I loved them both pretty much equally. How to describe this? This is very short, so it gets stuff done, and it's not like overly flowery or over atmospheric. Quite a few of these fairy tales are not super atmospheric. So if that's something you like in a book, like some of these recommendations aren't going to be for you. I think the one with the most atmosphere is probably Spinning Silver. The rest, that's not really their purpose. But I think that this book was just so cute and fun, and it's short. So I think that if it sounds interesting to you, give it a go, because it's really fun. So that was 10 retelling recommendations. Thank you for watching this video, and these are some of the retellings that I mentioned in this video. I'm sure I will make a part 2 of this or part 3 as I read more retellings. I love retellings, so if you have any that you know of that are not on this list, please let me know and tell me them in the comments, because I would love to read more retellings. I love retellings, and then maybe they will end up in another video. Let me know your favorite retelling down in the comments as well, and I will see you next time. Bye!